Imagine living in a world where the way you held your teacup, the tilt of your head, or even the sound of your footsteps could shape your reputation for life. A world where a woman's every move was watched, whispered about, and judged. This was a Victorian era, an age not just of industrial progress and grandeur, but of suffocatingly strange etiquette rules that made daily life performance. To survive in society, a woman had to master this endless theater of manners, where even the smallest slip could destroy her image. Victorian society revolved around the idea of respectability, and for women, this meant obeying an unwritten code that governed everything from speaking to breathing. It wasn't just about politeness. It was about status, identity, and marriage prospects. To break a rule, no matter how small, could mean being branded unrefined or improper. Families trained daughters from childhood in these rules, not because they were practical, but because society demanded them. In this world, a woman could be more harshly judged for stirring her tea incorrectly than for telling a lie. Tea time was at the heart of this elaborate show. It may sound simple. Pour the tea, sip politely, enjoy some biscuits, but for Victorian women, tea was a stage where reputations were built or broken. Holding the cup incorrectly was unthinkable. Thumb and index finger had to delicately balance the handle, never thrusting fingers through it, because that was common. Stirring had to be silent, with the spoon moved gently back and forth, never clinking against the porcelain. Blowing on hot tea, to cool it was forbidden. Patience was demanded. Slurping was scandalous. A woman who made any of these mistakes risked being branded as someone with poor breeding. Imagine being so tense over a cup of tea that every movement of your hand could spark gossip. It turned a casual drink into a nerve-wracking ordeal. But the scrutiny went far beyond teacups. Even clothing and how it interacted with the body was policed. Of all the taboos, the most infamous was the exposure of ankles. Today it may sound absurd, but in the Victorian imagination, an uncovered ankle was a shocking glimpse of intimacy. Dresses were long, layered, and heavy, not just to protect against cold, but to hide every curve. Women had to lift skirts carefully when walking outdoors, just enough to avoid mud, but never high enough to reveal too much. Some households even covered furniture legs with fabric, because the very shape was considered suggestive. An accidental flash of ankle could spark rumors, a dangerous thing in a society where reputation determined everything. Then came the endless rules of posture. A lady was never to slouch or appear too comfortable, for that suggested laziness or worse, looseness in character. She had to sit straight-backed, knees together, hands folded neatly in her lap. Crossing legs was strictly forbidden. Even when resting, she was expected to perform elegance. Upper-class women sometimes received training specifically on posture, practicing for hours on how to sit, walk, and even tilt the head at the right angle. The message was clear. Every muscle of a woman's body belonged to etiquette, not to herself. Yet within this suffocating rigidity, women found secret ways to communicate. The folding fans they carried were not just for cooling in the heat. They were tools of coded language. A fan drop meant one thing. Fanning slowly meant another, and covering part of the face meant something entirely different. Through these subtle signals, women expressed feelings and flirtations they could never voice aloud. But even here, one wrong move could mean disaster. Imagine meaning to signal friendship and instead accidentally suggesting marriage. Such was the risk of relying on silent codes in a world obsessed with rules. Walking in public also carried its own complicated expectations. Women were supposed to move with grace, slowly, never rushing or appearing hurried. To walk too fast was seen as unladylike, a sign of impatience or roughness. Their arms were to remain steady, not swinging. Gloves had to be worn outdoors at all times. Hats carefully secured so as not to appear sloppy. If a woman lifted her skirt too high to avoid mud, she risked indecency. Too low, and she would soil her dress, which was equally disgraceful. Even something as natural as walking was turned into a delicate balancing act of appearances. Conversation was no freer than movement. A Victorian woman was expected to speak softly, her voice carrying a gentle, almost musical tone. To laugh loudly, interrupt, or argue openly with men was considered crude. A lady's voice should never rise above the hum of polite chatter. Cleverness had to be cloaked in sweetness, with disguise as charm. Even when women had important thoughts, etiquette forced them to hold back, to remain pleasant ornaments rather than equal participants in discussion. Imagine being full of ideas but having to censor every word to avoid offense. This was the silent cage of etiquette. Courtship brought yet another layer of restrictions. Romantic interest could not be expressed openly. Women communicated through carefully written letters, often reviewed by family before being sent. The handwriting had to be elegant, the wording polite but never too forward. Even the paper mattered. Plain white was acceptable, but blue or brightly colored paper was frowned upon as childish. A woman who expressed too much emotion in her letters risked being judged as improper, while one who was too cold might be seen as heartless. Romance became not just about feelings, but about mastering the rules of correspondence. Life in this world was exhausting, a constant performance. Imagine waking each morning knowing that the way you dressed, walked, sat, smiled, drank, and even breathed would be dissected by the eyes of society. Women were actors on a stage where the script was unwritten yet unforgiving. For some, this system offered stability and predictability. But for most, it was a suffocating reminder that their worth was judged not by who they were, but by how well they followed rules. This was just the beginning. These were the everyday expectations that structured women's lives. But things would only get stranger from here. In the world of Victorian etiquette, even dinner tables, feigning spells, morning clothes, and laughter itself had rule books. And those rule books were even more bizarre. What you've heard so far was merely the warm-up. In the next part, we'll dive into the truly absurd, the dining disasters, the rules about grief, the rituals of dancing, and even how feigning had its own standards. Because in the Victorian age, there wasn't a single part of a woman's life untouched by the strangest etiquette rules imaginable. At the Victorian dinner table, etiquette was not just a suggestion. It was a battlefield where every bite could either elevate or humiliate a woman. Dining in public or in the presence of guests required almost theatrical control. Forks, knives, and spoons came in endless varieties, and choosing the wrong one was a social misstep that everyone noticed. A lady could not cut her bread with a knife, but had to delicately tear it with her fingers. She could not slather butter generously. It had to be placed gently, just enough to appear tasteful. Speaking with food in the mouth was unthinkable. Chewing too loudly was vulgar, and eating too quickly was greed. A woman had to pace her bites to match the rhythm of the table, never drawing attention, always poised. It was not just about nourishment. It was about showing refinement, as if eating was an art form rather than necessity. Greetings carried their own invisible rule book. A woman could not be the first to extend her hand to a man. She was to wait until he initiated. If she did offer her hand, it had to be soft, graceful, never firm, because strength was deemed unfeminine. A curtsy or a gentle nod was often more proper than any handshake. Misjudge this moment, and whispers could spread that she was forward, even aggressive. Something as small as a greeting carried the power to define a woman's character in the eyes of society, and every first impression had the weight of judgment. Corsets, with their merciless grip on the body, led to one of the most bizarre aspects of etiquette: fainting. Women fainted often because of restricted breathing, but even this involuntary act was expected to follow unspoken codes. To collapse too dramatically was considered a desperate cry for attention. To faint with elegance, with just the right measure of delicacy, was strangely admired. The fainting couch became a staple of parlors, not just for comfort, but because society expected women to swoon gracefully. Even unconsciousness was turned into a performance, another opportunity for society to comment on whether a woman had or lacked refinement. Death and mourning did not escape etiquette's grasp either. A widow was bound to wear black for 2 years, her entire identity swallowed by her grief on display. Jewelry was strictly limited to black enamel or jet, even down to the smallest brooch. Bright fabrics, laughter, or too quick a return of color could provoke scandal, as if grief were not genuine enough. After the deep mourning period, a woman could slowly reintroduce muted shades like gray or lavender, but always cautiously, always under society's watchful eye. Mourning was less about personal sorrow and more about proving adherence to a rigid script, a performance of loss where even tears were scrutinized. Social dances, which might seem like moments of freedom, were instead tightly bound by expectations. Women could not dance with the same man more than twice in one evening, lest tongues wag about secret romances. To refuse a dance without a solid reason risked offending not just a man, but the host of the event. Each movement on the dance floor was a delicate act of balance between appearing desirable yet not too eager, sociable yet not frivolous. The dance was less about joy and more about strategy, where every step was calculated to maintain honor. Even the act of looking at someone was weighed by rules. Eyes, which naturally reveal emotions, had to be controlled with precision. A prolonged gaze at a man suggested flirtation. Lowering the eyes signaled respect and modesty. To stare openly at anyone was scandalous. Women had to master the art of glancing, sending signals without ever appearing brazen. A single misjudged look could be twisted into gossip. Another reminder that nothing, even the direction of one's eyes, belonged entirely to the individual. Traveling, which might suggest freedom, was also governed by strict codes. A lady was never to travel alone unless escorted, as independence was suspicious. When riding in a carriage or train, she had to sit facing forward, her posture perfect, gloves never removed. If she dared venture without the proper attire or without company, she risked her reputation. Even journeys meant to liberate were transformed into another cage of manners, where society reached into the carriage to police how a woman carried herself. Smiles and laughter, those natural expressions of joy, were anything but free. A wide grin was condemned as childish and undignified. Laughter had to be soft, restrained, often covered with a hand or a fan. To laugh too loudly was to appear common, to reveal too much of one's true self. Joy itself had to be filtered through the lens of control, making happiness another act of self-censorship. Women learned to monitor their own emotions, showing only what was acceptable, never what was genuine. Motherhood, too, was watched with eagle eyes. A mother was expected not only to raise her children, but to present them as flawless extensions of her own discipline and refinement. Children had to be dressed neatly, behave politely, and remain quiet in public. A crying child reflected poorly on the mother's character, not the child's. Displays of frustration were forbidden. A Victorian mother lived under double pressure, to shape her children into reflections of society's ideals, and to never let the struggle show on her own face. The ridiculousness of these overlapping rules cannot be overstated. Women often found themselves trapped in contradictions, where obeying one expectation risked breaking another. One famous anecdote tells of a lady who refused to sit in a parlor because the only available chair had exposed legs, and she feared it indecent. Another reveals how women worried over the angle of their parasols in public, lest it suggests something improper. Life became a maze of absurd performances, where every act of living was tangled in judgment. At its heart, Victorian etiquette was about control. Society demanded perfection in every action, but perfection was impossible. Women were constantly anxious, second-guessing every gesture, every word. The rules claimed to protect dignity, but in truth, they robbed women of individuality, leaving them to live as fragile symbols of propriety. What seems laughable to us now, the scandal of an ankle, the art of fainting, the crime of laughing too loudly, was deadly serious in their time. Reputations were currency, and one careless act could bankrupt a woman standing forever. And yet, there is something revealing in all of this. These rules, as absurd as they seem, show us the immense pressure Victorian women lived under. They tell us how society feared women's independence, how even joy, grief, and love were placed under surveillance. They show us how a culture built elaborate cages and disguised them as manners. Today, we may sip tea loudly, laugh until our ribs ache, and walk briskly down the street without scandal. But in the Victorian age, each of those simple freedoms would have been a transgression. So the next time you drink from a teacup, tear a piece of bread, or burst into laughter with friends, think of those women bound by endless etiquette. What we consider ordinary, they risked reputations to avoid. Their world was a theater of absurdity where women were judged not for who they were, but for how tightly they obeyed society's strangest rules. And perhaps that is the greatest reminder that what seems laughable today once shaped lives with terrifying seriousness.